What if I told you that the woman everyone laughed at for marrying a poor mechanic was actually about to become one of the richest wives in America? While her friends whispered behind her back and her own mother begged her to reconsider, Emma had no idea she was walking down the aisle toward a $2 billion fortune. This is the incredible true story of how love, deception, and hidden wealth collided in the most unexpected way. You won't believe what happens when Emma finally discovers who her husband really is. But before we dive into this amazing story, I want to know, what city are you watching from right now? Drop your city name in the comments below. And if you love stories about hidden wealth, shocking revelations, and true love triumphing over everything, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible tales. The whispers started the moment Emma walked down the aisle in her modest wedding dress, her arm linked with her father's as they approached the altar where David stood waiting. The small chapel was filled with friends and family, but Emma could feel the weight of their judgmental stares burning into her back. She had heard the hushed conversations over the past months since announcing her engagement to David Chen, the quiet man who worked as a mechanic at the local auto repair shop. "She's throwing her life away," her college roommate Sarah had whispered to another guest just moments before the ceremony began. Emma graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, and she's marrying a grease monkey who can barely afford to take her to dinner at Applebee's. The comment stung, even though Emma pretended not to hear it. Her own mother had expressed similar concerns, wondering aloud how Emma planned to maintain the lifestyle she was accustomed to on a mechanic's salary. David's family, on the other hand, seemed genuinely happy for the couple, though they were noticeably more reserved than Emma's boisterous relatives. His parents, an elderly couple who spoke with slight accents that hinted at their immigrant background, beamed with pride as they watched their son prepare to marry the accomplished young woman he had fallen head over heels for 2 years earlier. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful. David had insisted on paying for everything himself, despite Emma's offers to help with the costs. "This is my responsibility," he had said firmly, his dark eyes serious behind his wire-rimmed glasses. A man should be able to provide for his wedding. Emma had found his old-fashioned values endearing, even if it meant settling for a smaller venue and fewer frills than she might have preferred. As they exchanged vows, Emma noticed how David's hands shook slightly as he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger. She had been surprised when he had proposed with a modest diamond ring, nothing like the extravagant rocks her friends had received from their wealthy boyfriends. But there was something in David's eyes when he looked at her, a depth of love and devotion that made her heart skip a beat every time. The reception was held in the church basement, decorated with flowers that David's mother had grown in her garden. Emma's sorority sisters clustered together at one table, their designer dresses looking out of place among the folding chairs and paper tablecloths. She could see them exchanging looks and whispering behind their hands, no doubt discussing how far their former president had fallen. It hurt more than Emma cared to admit, but when David took her hand for their first dance to an old Elvis song playing from a borrowed sound system, she found herself forgetting about everyone else in the room. In his arms, swaying to the music in her simple white dress, she had never felt more beautiful or more loved. The evening ended with David carrying her over the threshold of their small 2-bedroom apartment above the Chinese restaurant where his uncle worked. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and as Emma looked around at the second-hand furniture and the view of the parking lot from their bedroom window, she told herself that love was more important than money, even if everyone else thought she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The first year of marriage was harder than Emma had expected. Living on David's mechanic's salary meant making sacrifices she had never had to consider before. She traded her BMW for a used Honda Civic that David had fixed up himself, and her wardrobe of designer suits was gradually replaced with more practical clothing from discount stores. The adjustment was difficult, but Emma was determined to make their marriage work, even as the whispers from her former social circle grew louder and more frequent. "I saw Emma at the grocery store yesterday," her former colleague Jennifer mentioned during a lunch meeting at the country club where Emma used to be a member. "She was using coupons and buying generic brands. Can you imagine? She used to spend more on a single bottle of wine than she probably spends on groceries for a week now." The women shook their heads in a mixture of pity and superiority, grateful that they had made more sensible choices in their own marriages. Emma's mother, Margaret, was perhaps the most vocal critic of her daughter's decision. During their weekly phone calls, she never missed an opportunity to point out everything Emma was missing by marrying beneath her station. "The Morrison girl just got engaged to that young lawyer from the firm downtown," she would say. "They're planning a destination wedding in Italy. Remember when you used to talk about having your wedding in Tuscany? Before you settled for that church basement reception, of course. The comments were like tiny daggers, each one chipping away at Emma's confidence. She began to wonder if everyone was right, if she had been foolish to choose love over financial security. David worked long hours at the garage, often coming home covered in grease and motor oil, his clothes stained and his hands calloused from years of manual labor. He was nothing like the polished professionals Emma had dated before, the men in expensive suits who took her to five-star restaurants and talked about their stock portfolios over champagne. But David had qualities that those men had lacked. He listened when she talked about her day, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He brought her flowers from the garden behind their building, not because it was a special occasion, but simply because he thought they would brighten her day. When Emma caught a terrible flu that winter, David took time off work to care for her, making homemade soup and sitting beside her bed reading aloud from her favorite novels until she fell asleep. Still, the financial pressures were real and growing. Emma had been forced to give up her membership to the gym where she used to take yoga classes with her friends, and their date nights consisted mainly of walks in the park or movie rentals from the library. When her Harvard Business School classmates organized their annual reunion dinner at an exclusive restaurant downtown, Emma had to decline because they simply couldn't afford the cost of the meal, let alone a new dress appropriate for the occasion. David seemed oblivious to the social pressures Emma was facing, or perhaps he was simply better at ignoring them. He approached their modest life with a contentment that sometimes frustrated Emma, who had grown up believing that success was measured by material possessions and social status. "As long as we have each other, we have everything we need," he would say when Emma expressed concern about their finances or their social isolation from her former friends. The worst moment came during Emma's birthday that second year. She had hoped David might splurge on something special, perhaps a dinner at a nice restaurant or a weekend getaway. Instead, he presented her with a handmade photo album filled with pictures of their courtship and wedding, along with little notes he had written describing his favorite memories of their time together. It was thoughtful and personal, but Emma couldn't help feeling disappointed as she thought about the expensive jewelry and exotic trips her friends received from their husbands on their birthdays. It was during their second year of marriage that Emma first began to notice the strange phone calls. David would receive calls at odd hours, usually in the evening after dinner, and he would always step outside to take them, speaking in hushed tones that Emma couldn't quite make out through the thin walls of their apartment. When she asked about the calls, David would simply say they were work-related, but Emma knew that the auto repair shop where he worked closed at 6 o'clock, and these calls often came well after 9 or 10 at night. The calls seemed to make David tense and preoccupied. After hanging up, he would often pace around their small living room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture Emma had learned to recognize as a sign of stress. Sometimes he would disappear into their bedroom for hours, claiming he needed to research parts for a particularly challenging repair job, but Emma noticed that he never brought any car manuals or technical documents home from work. Emma's curiosity was further piqued when she began noticing that David seemed to have an unusual amount of knowledge about subjects that had nothing to do with automotive repair. During a conversation about the stock market crash that was dominating the news, David made several astute observations about market volatility and investment strategies that surprised Emma with their sophistication. When she commented on his insights, David quickly changed the subject, claiming he had just picked up bits of information from customers who worked in finance. The mystery deepened when Emma discovered a stack of business journals and financial newspapers hidden beneath some old work clothes in David's dresser drawer. The publications were current and appeared to have been thoroughly read, with certain articles marked and annotated in David's careful handwriting. When confronted about them, David claimed that he enjoyed reading about business and economics in his spare time, but his explanation felt hollow and unconvincing. Emma's suspicions reached a new level when she accidentally answered David's cell phone while he was in the shower. The caller, an older man with a refined accent, asked to speak with Mr. Chen about the quarterly reports, and mentioned something about the board meeting scheduled for next week. When Emma explained that David was unavailable, the man seemed surprised and asked if she was Mrs. Chen, then quickly apologized and hung up before Emma could ask any questions. When David emerged from the bathroom, Emma told him about the call, watching carefully for his reaction. David's face went pale, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he explained that he had been doing some freelance consulting work for a small business owner who needed help with his bookkeeping, and the man must have been calling about that. The explanation was plausible, but something in David's manner suggested there was more to the story than he was willing to share. The secrecy began to create a rift between them. Emma had always prided herself on being part of a partnership based on openness and honesty, but now she felt like David was keeping significant parts of his life hidden from her. She began to wonder if he was having an affair, or worse, if he was involved in something illegal. The man she had married had seemed so straightforward and genuine, but now she was beginning to question whether she really knew him at all. The tension came to a head during a dinner with David's parents, when his mother made an offhand comment about being proud of how David was handling the transition, and how difficult it must be for him to live so simply after everything he was used to. When Emma asked what she meant, both David and his mother quickly changed the subject, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was some important piece of the puzzle that everyone was keeping from her. Emma's growing suspicions about David's mysterious behavior led her to start paying closer attention to the small details of their daily life together. She noticed that despite his claims of financial struggle, David never seemed truly worried about money the way she was. When their car needed expensive repairs, David handled the situation with a calm confidence that seemed inconsistent with their supposedly tight budget. When Emma expressed concern about how they would pay for the work, David simply said not to worry about it, that everything would work out fine. The more Emma observed, the more inconsistencies she discovered. David's work clothes, which she had initially assumed were old and worn from years of use, were actually high-quality garments that had been deliberately distressed to look shabby. His tools, which he kept in an old toolbox in their bedroom closet, were top-of-the-line equipment that would have cost thousands of dollars new. When Emma asked about them, David claimed they had been gifts from his previous employer, but she couldn't imagine any auto repair shop giving away such expensive tools to a departing employee. Even more puzzling was David's behavior during their rare social outings. At a charity fundraiser that Emma's former colleagues had invited them to attend, David had demonstrated an extensive knowledge of art and culture that seemed far beyond what a working-class mechanic should possess. He discussed the techniques of Renaissance painters with an art dealer and made knowledgeable comments about classical music that impressed even Emma, who had taken art history courses in college. When questioned about his interests, David claimed he enjoyed reading about these subjects in the library, but Emma was beginning to doubt these simple explanations. The breaking point came when Emma accidentally discovered David's laptop hidden in a shoebox at the back of their bedroom closet. The computer was an expensive model that would have cost several months of David's salary, and when Emma managed to guess his password, her birthday, she found files and documents that made no sense in the context of his supposed job as a mechanic. There were spreadsheets tracking complex financial transactions, emails discussing board meetings and corporate acquisitions, and documents that appeared to be legal contracts involving millions of dollars. One email in particular caught Emma's attention. It was from someone named Robert Chen, who appeared to be addressing David as his nephew and discussing the family's expectations regarding David's experiment in normal life. The email mentioned something about a trust fund and expressed concern about whether David was ready to resume his responsibilities to the family business. Emma read the message several times, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Emma confronted David that evening when he returned from work, demanding an explanation for what she had found. David's usual calm demeanor cracked, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed genuinely distressed. He sat down heavily on their second-hand couch, removed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes before finally looking up at Emma with an expression of resignation and guilt. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. "When I met you, I was planning to tell you the truth after a few dates, but then I fell in love with you, and I was afraid that if you knew who I really was, you would only want me for my money." Emma stared at him in confusion, still not understanding what he was trying to tell her. David took a deep breath and continued, "My real name is David Chin Morrison. I'm the heir to the Morrison Industries fortune." Emma felt the room spin around her as the implications of David's revelation sank in. Morrison Industries was one of the largest conglomerates in the country, involved in everything from technology to real estate to international shipping. The Morrison family was worth billions, their name synonymous with wealth and power. And she had been married to the heir of this empire for 2 years without knowing it, living in poverty while her husband possessed one of the largest fortunes in the world. Emma's mind struggled to process David's revelation as he continued his explanation, his voice heavy with guilt and apprehension. "I took the job at the auto repair shop as part of what my family called character building," he explained, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "My grandfather believed that before I could take over the family business, I needed to understand what it meant to work with my hands and earn an honest living. It was supposed to last 6 months, but then I met you, and everything changed." The auto repair shop, David revealed, was actually owned by a subsidiary of Morrison Industries, though it operated as an independent business. David's salary was real enough, but it represented only a fraction of his actual income from various trust funds and investments that he had established over the years. The small apartment above the Chinese restaurant, their modest lifestyle, the carefully maintained appearance of financial struggle, all of it had been an elaborate performance that David had continued far longer than originally intended. "I wanted to tell you so many times," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "Especially during our engagement, when I saw how your friends and family were treating you. I hated watching you sacrifice so much for what you thought was love, when I could have given you everything you wanted and more. But I was terrified that if you knew the truth, you would question whether your feelings for me were real, or if you were just attracted to the money." Emma sat in stunned silence as David explained how he had fallen in love with her precisely because she had been willing to give up her comfortable lifestyle for him. In a world where he had always been surrounded by people who wanted something from him, business opportunities, social connections, access to his family's wealth and influence, Emma had been the first person to love him for who he was rather than what he could provide. Or at least, that's what he had believed. The phone calls, David explained, had been with his Uncle Robert and other family members who served on the board of directors for Morrison Industries. They had been growing increasingly impatient with David's experiment, and were pressuring him to return to his duties within the company. Several major deals were pending that required his input and approval, and his continued absence was beginning to affect the family's business interests. "The quarterly reports, the board meetings, all of it is real," David said. "I've been trying to manage my responsibilities remotely, but it's becoming impossible to maintain the pretense while also fulfilling my obligations to the company. My family has been incredibly patient, but they're starting to lose confidence in my ability to balance both worlds." Emma felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her: betrayal, confusion, relief, and anger, all competing for dominance in her mind. On one hand, she was devastated that David had lied to her for so long, that their entire marriage had been built on a foundation of deception. On the other hand, she couldn't deny feeling a sense of vindication knowing that all the people who had mocked her choice of husband had been completely wrong about David's worth and prospects. "What about your parents?" Emma asked, thinking about the humble elderly couple who had welcomed her so warmly into their family. David smiled sadly and explained that they were his adoptive parents, a working-class couple who had raised him after his biological parents died in a car accident when he was 12. The Morrison family had wanted to provide David with a normal childhood experience, so they had arranged for him to live with the Chens while still maintaining his connection to his biological family's business empire. "They know who I really am," David said. "But they love me as their son, not as the Morrison heir. They've been keeping my secret because they understand how important it was for me to find someone who could love me for myself, not for my inheritance." The revelation explained the cryptic comments David's mother had made about him handling the transition, and living so simply after everything he was used to. As the full scope of David's deception became clear, Emma realized that her life was about to change dramatically once again, but this time, in ways she could never have imagined. The transformation of Emma's life began almost immediately after David's revelation. Within days of their conversation, David arranged for them to move from their modest apartment above the Chinese restaurant to a penthouse suite in one of the city's most exclusive buildings. The contrast was jarring, from a cramped two-bedroom space with a view of a parking lot to a sprawling luxury apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Emma found herself overwhelmed by the opulence of their new surroundings. The penthouse was furnished with priceless antiques and original artwork that David casually mentioned had been in his family for generations. The master bedroom alone was larger than their entire previous apartment, complete with a walk-in closet that seemed to stretch on forever and a marble bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel. "This is just temporary," David explained as Emma wandered through the rooms in a daze. "I wanted us to have some privacy while we figure out our next steps. The family estate is about an hour outside the city, but I thought it might be too overwhelming to move there immediately." Emma couldn't imagine anything more overwhelming than what she was already experiencing, but she nodded mutely, still trying to process the magnitude of the change in their circumstances. David's Uncle Robert visited them that first week, and Emma immediately understood where David had inherited his quiet intelligence and careful manner of speaking. Robert Chin Morrison was an elegant man in his 60s, impeccably dressed and possessing the kind of natural authority that came from a lifetime of wielding significant power. He greeted Emma warmly, but she could sense him evaluating her, trying to determine whether she was worthy of his nephew's affections and the family's trust. "David has told us so much about you," Robert said over dinner in the penthouse's formal dining room, served by a staff that had appeared as if by magic. "We're all very eager to welcome you properly into the family. I hope you'll forgive us for the unusual circumstances of your introduction to our world." Emma found herself tongue-tied in the presence of this man who wielded influence over billions of dollars and employed thousands of people around the globe. The financial reality of David's situation was almost incomprehensible to Emma. During a meeting with the family's financial advisors, she learned that David's personal net worth exceeded $2 billion, not including his stake in Morrison Industries and various other family holdings. The modest wedding ring he had given her was replaced with a stunning diamond that had once belonged to his biological mother, worth more than most people's houses. Emma's wardrobe was quickly and dramatically updated by a team of personal shoppers who seemed to know her measurements and style preferences without asking. Designer gowns, couture suits, and accessories that she had only dreamed of owning suddenly filled the enormous closet in their new home. When Emma protested that it was too much, David simply smiled and said, "This is who we are now. You're going to need appropriate clothing for the events we'll be attending." Those events, Emma soon discovered, were a far cry from the church potluck dinners and neighborhood barbecues that had comprised their social calendar for the past 2 years. Within a month, they were attending charity galas where individual donations routinely exceeded Emma's former annual salary, gallery openings featuring artists whose work hung in major museums, and dinner parties with politicians, celebrities, and business leaders whose names regularly appeared in newspaper headlines. The most challenging aspect of the transition was learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of the ultra-wealthy. Emma discovered that among the Morrison family's circle, conversation was a carefully choreographed dance of implied meanings and unspoken hierarchies. Business deals worth millions of dollars were discussed casually over cocktails, and personal relationships were often indistinguishable from professional alliances. Emma's mother, Margaret, was perhaps the most shocked by the dramatic turn of events. The woman who had spent 2 years lamenting her daughter's poor choice in husbands suddenly found herself bragging to anyone who would listen about her son-in-law's impressive business acumen and her daughter's good fortune in marrying into such a distinguished family. The hypocrisy was not lost on Emma, who had learned to smile politely while privately noting which of her former critics were now eager to renew their friendships with her. The revelation of David's true identity had immediate and dramatic consequences for Emma's relationships with the people who had spent 2 years mocking her marriage. The same friends and family members who had whispered behind her back about her poor judgment and wasted potential suddenly found themselves scrambling to repair bridges they had carelessly burned. The transformation in their attitudes was both swift and transparently self-serving. Sarah, Emma's former college roommate who had been particularly vocal in her criticism, was among the first to reach out with a carefully worded apology. "I always knew there was something special about David," she claimed during a lunch meeting at an expensive restaurant where she had clearly hoped to be seen with Emma. "I could tell he had hidden depths. You were so smart to see his potential when the rest of us couldn't." Emma listened to the revisionist history with polite detachment, recognizing the desperation behind Sarah's forced enthusiasm. The social rehabilitation extended beyond individual relationships to encompass entire social circles that had previously excluded the couple. Country club memberships that had been quietly revoked were suddenly reinstated with profuse apologies and explanations about administrative errors. Charity organizations that had never responded to Emma's offers to volunteer now courted her participation with flattering titles and prominent committee positions. Perhaps most telling was the response from Emma's former colleagues at the consulting firm where she had worked before marriage. The partners who had expressed concern about her judgment when she announced her engagement to a mechanic now called regularly with invitations to rejoin the firm in an elevated position. They spoke enthusiastically about creating a special role that would allow her to leverage her new social connections for the benefit of their client base. Emma's mother experienced perhaps the most dramatic reversal in perspective. Margaret, who had spent countless phone conversations lamenting her daughter's fall from grace, now spoke of David with glowing admiration. "I always knew that young man had good breeding," she claimed, apparently forgetting her previous characterizations of him as unsuitable and lacking in ambition. She began planning elaborate dinner parties specifically to show off her son-in-law to her social circle. The hypocrisy was overwhelming, but what disturbed Emma most was her own reaction to these changed circumstances. Despite her intellectual understanding that these people's newfound acceptance was shallow and mercenary, she couldn't deny feeling a sense of vindication. After 2 years of social isolation and condescending pity, it was satisfying to watch the same people who had dismissed her judgment now compete for her attention and approval. David handled the social transformation with characteristic grace and apparent indifference. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the attention they were receiving from people who had previously ignored or dismissed them. "I don't understand why everyone is suddenly so interested in us," he told Emma after a particularly obsequious encounter with some of her former friends. "We're the same people we were last month." But Emma knew that wasn't entirely true. The knowledge of David's wealth and status had changed something fundamental in how she saw their relationship and her place in the world. She found herself second-guessing her memories of their courtship and early marriage, wondering which moments had been genuine and which had been performances. Had David's modest proposals for their dates been due to financial constraints, or had he been testing her willingness to accept a simple lifestyle? The question that haunted Emma most was whether her own feelings had been influenced by David's deception. She had fallen in love with a humble mechanic who worked with his hands and lived paycheck to paycheck. Now she was married to one of the wealthiest men in the country, someone whose family name carried immense social and political influence. Were her feelings for David authentic, or had she been unconsciously attracted to qualities that reflected his privileged background and superior education? The complexity of these emotional questions was compounded by practical considerations about their future together. David's revelation had opened doors to a world of opportunities and experiences that Emma had never imagined possible, but it had also created expectations and responsibilities that she wasn't sure she was prepared to handle. The woman who had once struggled to afford generic groceries now had access to more money than she could spend in several lifetimes. But with that wealth came obligations to family, business, and society that seemed overwhelming in their scope and complexity. 6 months after David's revelation, Emma stood in the mirror of their master bedroom at the Morrison family estate, adjusting the diamond necklace that had belonged to David's biological grandmother. Tonight was the annual Morrison Industries Charity Gala, an event that would formally introduce Emma to the company's board of directors, major shareholders, and most important business partners. It would be her official debut as David Chin Morrison's wife and a member of one of the country's most influential families. The estate itself was like something from a fairy tale, a sprawling mansion set on hundreds of acres of manicured grounds. Emma had initially felt intimidated by the grandeur of the place, with its marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, and rooms filled with priceless artwork. But gradually, with David's patient guidance and the warm welcome of his extended family, she had begun to feel at home in surroundings that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. David appeared behind her in the mirror, adjusting his bow tie with the easy confidence of someone born to wear formal attire. "You look beautiful," he said, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Are you ready for tonight?" Emma nodded, though she still felt nervous about the scrutiny she would face from people who had known David since childhood and who would be evaluating her worthiness to stand beside him. The gala was a stunning success, raising over $10 million for childhood education programs in underserved communities. Emma found herself genuinely moved by the cause and impressed by the family's commitment to philanthropy. She had expected the ultra-wealthy to be detached from social problems, but the Morrison family's charitable foundation was actively involved in dozens of programs that made real differences in people's lives. Throughout the evening, Emma was struck by how naturally David moved through the crowd of influential guests. This was clearly his world, the environment where he belonged, and seeing him in his element helped Emma understand why he had been so conflicted about maintaining his deception for so long. The man she had married was not just a mechanic playing dress-up. He was a sophisticated business leader who had been educated from childhood to handle enormous responsibilities. The most meaningful moment of the evening came when Emma was approached by Mrs. Chen, David's adoptive mother, who had been watching proudly from across the room as Emma navigated conversations with governors, CEOs, and foreign dignitaries. "I want you to know how happy you've made our son," the older woman said quietly, taking Emma's hands in hers. "We were so worried that he would never find someone who could love him for who he truly is, rather than what he represents." Emma realized that Mrs. Chen was right. David's deception, while painful and confusing, had ultimately been motivated by a desire to be loved authentically. In a world where his wealth and status made it impossible to form genuine relationships, he had created an elaborate fiction that allowed him to experience normal human connection. It had been wrong to deceive her, but Emma could understand the loneliness and vulnerability that had driven his actions. As the evening wound down and they returned to their suite at the estate, Emma and David sat together on the balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, reflecting on how dramatically their lives had changed. "Do you regret any of it?" David asked, his voice quiet and uncertain. The deception, the upheaval, everything that's happened? Emma considered the question carefully. Her life had been turned upside down, and she was still adjusting to responsibilities and expectations she had never imagined facing. The people who had once mocked her marriage now treated her with exaggerated respect that felt hollow and opportunistic. But she was also able to contribute to causes she cared about, to experience beauty and culture in ways that had been impossible before, and to build a future with a man who had risked everything to find authentic love. "I don't regret falling in love with you," Emma said finally. "Whether you were David the mechanic or David the billionaire heir, you're still the same person who brought me flowers from the garden and took care of me when I was sick. The money changes a lot of things, but it doesn't change what matters most." David pulled her close, and as they sat together under the stars, Emma realized that while their story had begun with deception, it had evolved into something real and lasting. A partnership built on love, trust, and mutual respect that could weather any revelation or transformation life might bring. Looking back, Emma could laugh at the irony of the situation. All those people who had laughed at her for marrying a simple man had been completely wrong, but not in the way any of them could have imagined. David had indeed been much more than he appeared, but the qualities that made him truly valuable, his kindness, integrity, and capacity for love, had nothing to do with his family's fortune. In the end, Emma had made the right choice after all, though for reasons that no one, including herself, had fully understood at the time.